You're done. That was all he said. No context, no build-up, just those two flat words delivered with the same fake calm he used when ordering a latte. The kind of shrug that tried to make cruelty sound like procedure. Across the narrow glass table sat Evan Caro, head of risk strategy at Brightwell Systems, the type of mid-tier tech consultancy that bragged about innovation while still printing forms in triplicate. His tie was crooked, as always, a half-hearted symbol of control. On the other side sat Rachel Myers, who'd spent the last decade quietly rewriting every compliance manual this man had pretended to author. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and worn-out ambition. He leaned back, arms folded, and said, "Department realignment," as if that explained why her badge would stop working by noon. She had come in with a binder full of vendor audit plans, risk flow diagrams, and an idea that might have saved the company $500,000 in redundant controls. Instead, she was getting streamlined out of existence. Rachel didn't flinch. Her fingers stayed resting on the folder, her knuckles pale, her breath steady. "I'd like 5 minutes to finalize my documentation," she said. Evan waved her off. "Sure, just leave your badge." He was already checking his phone. She walked out of that building like someone leaving a crime scene she didn't commit. Box in her arms, dignity folded neatly on top. No tears, no theatrics. Just the muffled rhythm of low heels against carpet, and the hum of fluorescent lights swallowing the sound of everything she didn't say. Because Rachel wasn't clueless. She'd noticed the oversights, the after-hours purchase approvals, the vendor with no listed website, the holiday weekend billing override labeled manual exception. She had watched Evan charm procurement into skipping the redundant reconciliation step under the banner of agility. That night, she didn't cry or pour wine or text old coworkers for pity. She opened her laptop, logged into the offboarding portal, and began writing her exit documentation. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. A scalpel disguised as a paragraph. Paragraph 3, to be exact. Unapproved expenditure. Vendor VX99. Executive override by exception, unverified. Timestamp, alias, badge ID. All included, all factual, all deadly. She didn't write it in anger. She wrote it like someone filing a lab report on a toxin sample. Cold, clear, clinical. Because Rachel understood something most people don't. Silence only hurts when it stays undocumented. When she hit submit, her hands didn't tremble. Report uploaded, CC'd to legal, HR, and internal audit, exactly as policy required. Then she shut her laptop and went to bed, feeling something close to peace. Not triumph, just the same calm you feel after hitting submit on your taxes and knowing the numbers line up. Brightwell Systems had been her world once, but that world had rot in its beams and she'd just traced where the mold began. Rachel wasn't vengeful. She was methodical. Years of cleaning up other people's shortcuts had trained her hands to document everything before it disappeared. The next morning, while most people were sleeping off weekend brunch, Rachel was in her garage sorting old tools when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, then picked up. "Rachel? It's Tom Becker, procurement." He sounded like someone who'd just opened a door to find a live grenade. "That entry in your offboarding report? Paragraph 3. Did you write that intentionally?" Rachel set down the box, leaned against the workbench. "I documented the facts. What other people choose to do with them is not my concern." Silence stretched. Then Tom exhaled, low and shaky. "You just dropped a grenade into a folder labeled Do Not Open." Rachel's reply was simple. Then maybe they should have labeled it better. She hung up. She didn't need confirmation. The call was confirmation. Somewhere in that sterile office, the walls had started whispering her paragraph. The quiet kind of whisper that spreads like fire through audit trails and server logs. Because Brightwell's house was made of shortcuts, and all she'd done was light a match. By Monday morning, the air inside Brightwell Systems felt different, thicker, charged. The lobby receptionist's smile twitched. Security guards hovered near the badge scanners a little longer than usual, and the office slack had gone strangely silent. Then came the suits. Not Brightwell suits. Client suits. Crisp, dark, coordinated. 3 men and a woman carrying slim leather folders embossed with the logo of Langward Consulting, Brightwell's largest federal client and compliance partner. They didn't ask for visitor badges or coffee. They went straight upstairs, escorted by Maya Trent, the head of internal audit who used to shadow Rachel during controls reviews. They disappeared into Conference Room D, the same one Rachel had used for quarterly vendor reconciliation sessions. By the time the door shut, everyone in the building could feel it. Evan Caro was on his second lukewarm Starbucks when HR pinged him. "Are you available? External auditors just arrived." He told himself it was routine. He told himself lots of things. But when Amber from HR texted, they mentioned vendor VX99, the coffee went sour in his mouth. VX99, the ghost vendor, the one with the manual override he'd justified as client critical. He thought about calling legal, but that would draw attention. He thought about deleting emails, but that would be worse. So he did what middle managers always do when the water starts rising. He sat very still and hoped no one noticed the bubbles. Meanwhile, Rachel was sitting in her kitchen, sipping lemon tea and scrolling through freelance compliance postings she wasn't sure she wanted. She didn't know that her name had already been mentioned in 3 internal calls and 1 client audit briefing. She didn't know that her exit report had triggered an exception trace review. She just knew that somewhere, the silence she'd left behind had begun to echo. At 10:47 a.m., Evan's assistant popped her head into his office, eyes wide and voice too steady. "Compliance wants you in D room." He nodded, pretended calm, adjusted his crooked tie, and followed her down the hall like a man walking toward a cliff pretending it's a treadmill. Inside Conference Room D sat Daniel Kaplan, Langard's lead auditor, a silver-haired man with the facial expression of an empty spreadsheet. Beside him was Clara Schultz, the client's new chief compliance officer. Cool, composed, unreadable. There was 1 sheet of paper in front of her. It was Rachel's exit report, paragraph 3, highlighted in yellow. Kaplan gestured to a seat. "Thank you for joining us, Mr. Caro." Evan forced a smile. "Of course. Anything I can clarify?" Kaplan flipped open a binder. "We're reconciling vendor authorization records, Q2 through Q3. We've identified an override that bypassed procurement and legal routing. Vendor VX99. Care to explain?" Evan cleared his throat. "That was an internal acceleration. Routine. We needed to fast-track vendor onboarding to meet delivery timelines. All above board." Clara didn't blink. "Your badge log says otherwise." She rotated a page toward him. "Badge ID 1134C. Sunday, July 3rd, 6:41 p.m. Federal holiday. Only 1 badge active." His. Evan's throat tightened. There must be a systems glitch. Kaplan shook his head. "We cross-referenced with building access. No glitch, so we'll need your override logs for the last 2 fiscal years." It wasn't a request. Clara added, "Effective immediately. All reimbursements linked to your department are frozen pending audit review. Any vendors without dual verification will be suspended." The hum of the air vent filled the silence. Evan nodded, but his mouth stayed open like he'd forgotten how to close it. Across the room, Janet from IT, usually invisible, finally spoke. "We actually flagged VX99 6 months ago," she said, voice steady. "Procurement requested documentation. Never received." Eyes turned. Janet lifted her laptop, scrolled, then spun it toward Kaplan. "Ticket SVR 8882. Hold notice still open." Kaplan nodded. "That's confirmation." No one shouted. No one accused. But the air changed. The kind of shift you can't see but can feel. the moment a room realizes the story's already written. Evan looked at the highlighted line again. Vendor VX99. Executive override by exception. Unverified. A single paragraph that now had the weight of an anvil. And all he could think, as sweat slid under his collar, was how quiet Rachel had been when she left. That night, long after the office lights dimmed and the last meeting had bled into silence, Rachel was brushing her teeth when her phone buzzed with a LinkedIn notification. Subject line: Quick question. Brightwell Systems. Sender: Greg Lawson, Director of Risk Integration, Langward Consulting. The same firm whose auditors had just flanked Evan in Conference Room D. She tapped his profile. Polished, neutral, the kind of man whose handshake probably cost money. She hesitated, then opened the message. Hi Rachel, I recently came across your exit documentation, specifically paragraph 3. Would you be open to a short, off-site conversation? Informal. Coffee's on me. It didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like curiosity wrapped in restraint. Rachel didn't answer immediately. She went for a walk, hands in her jacket pockets, letting the cool night air file down her nerves. When she finally replied, the words were simple. Sure. Noon tomorrow, Liberty Plaza Cafe. She chose it because it was public, quiet, and forgettable. Just a small atrium between a dentist's office and a print shop. Greg arrived exactly at noon. No entourage, no briefcase, just a gray jacket, neat notebook, and the calm of someone used to extracting truth from professionals who should have known better. Appreciate your time, he said, setting his phone face down. No papers, no lawyers, just clarity. Rachel nodded. If you were serving me, you'd have done it already. That earned the faintest smile. They ordered coffee. Black for her, chamomile for him. Greg didn't waste time. Your report flagged something we've been circling for months. Vendor VX99 connects to a billing trail that's unusual. I need to know how confident you are in your audit trail. Rachel reached into her purse, pulled out a small silver USB, and slid it across the table. Everything's time-stamped, she said evenly. Badge access logs, policy memos, email threads, revision histories, even the override directive Evan sent from his personal email to his work account. Folders encrypted, passwords on the label. Greg looked down. On the small white sticker, one word was written in clean block letters. Clarity. You realize this may place your former department under legal review? He asked. Rachel didn't blink. I realize that, yes, but I also realize that pretending not to see something doesn't make it cleaner. Greg studied her for a moment. Why document all this if you knew you were leaving? Rachel's voice stayed steady. Because I knew no one would believe me if I said it out loud. But they'd believe the logs. That's how survival works in places like Brightwell. You don't get loud. You get accurate. Greg nodded slowly, like someone recognizing his own reflection in a mirror he hadn't looked at for a while. He pocketed the drive. If we need confirmation for litigation, you'll receive an affidavit and hash log for verification. Rachel nodded, already prepped the hashes. SHA 512. He actually smiled at that, a compliance joke that landed like respect. As they stood to leave, he said, For what it's worth, Ms. Myers, that one paragraph might have just saved millions in client exposure. She shook his hand. It wasn't about the money, she said. It was about the truth being louder than his voice for once. By Tuesday morning, the storm that had started as one paragraph had spread through Brightwell's hallways like a virus. The elevator chatter died. Meeting invites were suddenly vague. Half the leadership team had gone dark on Slack. Legal had blocked calendar access for entire departments. The few who dared whisper used phrases like frozen accounts, contract hold, and client review. Evan arrived late, tie missing, eyes ringed with exhaustion. His badge still worked, but it took 2 tries. At 9:13 a.m., an invite hit his inbox. Internal review. Confer room 6B. No end time. That phrase alone made him sweat. Legal was already there when he walked in. 2 attorneys, silent, notebooks open. "Let's start with vendor VX99, one said flatly. "Walk us through your rationale." He tried charm first, then confusion, then partial memory. None worked. Across the table, HR took notes like a court stenographer watching a slow execution. Every excuse he gave landed with the dull thud of paperwork sealing shut. And somewhere across town, Rachel sipped her tea and felt, not joy, but inevitability. Inside Brightwell Systems, the unraveling wasn't loud. It was clinical. By Wednesday, every open project linked to Evan's department was suspended pending compliance review. Client calls were suddenly postponed without reason. Contractors received notice of delayed payment due to internal restructuring. In the Austin branch, a project team had to cancel hotel bookings out of pocket after their travel card froze mid-checkout. Word spread fast, not just inside the company, but across the vendor network. The story always began the same way. Something about an override. Some vendor that didn't exist. The board was supposed to meet that afternoon for a quarterly governance call. It turned into a damage control summit. The CFO's camera stayed off. The general counsel's voice had the brittle calm of someone negotiating a surrender. One director asked, "Is this connected to the VX99 anomaly listed in the risk ledger?" Another followed, "And is Caro still employed?" No one answered. That silence said enough. Meanwhile, Rachel sat in a small co-working office she'd rented downtown, the kind with exposed brick and too much optimism in the decor. She wasn't refreshing news feeds or checking LinkedIn for gossip. She was reviewing the new compliance documentation she'd been casually asked to comment on by a former colleague from accounting, an internal memo now making rounds at Brightwell. All executive overrides suspended pending legal review. 2 fiscal years under audit. All vendor exceptions require dual authentication. She read those words twice, then closed the file. There was no glee in her chest, only the steady quiet of validation. Across town, Evan was unraveling. He hadn't slept. His inbox had turned into a crime scene of flagged threads and follow-ups. Legal wanted copies of every manual approval from the last 24 months. Finance wanted explanations for cost differentials. Procurement had stopped taking his calls. The one person who'd once called him indispensable, his VP buddy Mark Delaney, was suddenly CCing legal on every response. By Thursday morning, the end came disguised as routine. A meeting invite, conference room C, 10 o'clock a.m., required attendance. Evan walked in to find the room colder than usual, lights bright enough to sting. At the head of the table sat Clara Schultz, the client's chief compliance officer, posture sharp as iron. Beside her was Daniel Kaplan from Langard, silent as ever, his binder closed like a verdict. On the other side were 2 Brightwell compliance officers, ex-military by their bearing, plus HR, plus Mark, pale and sweating. Clara tapped the table once. "This entry," she said softly, was flagged by someone who understood exactly what it meant. She turned a printed page around. Rachel's exit report. Paragraph 3 still highlighted in yellow. Unapproved expenditure. Vendor VX99. Executive override by exception. Unverified. Kaplan's voice carried the weight of bureaucracy. "Mr. Caro, care to explain?" Evan opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I don't recall the specifics. There were many vendors. Things moved quickly." Clara tilted her head. "According to system logs, things moved on a federal holiday, when no one else was in the building." Kaplan gestured, and one of the compliance officers projected a slide onto the wall. A single line of data glowed against the white paint. Badge 1134C. Access 6:43 p.m. Terminal 9A. Override manual Executive level. Every eye in the room followed the line to the next column. Authorized user, E. Caro. No assistant, no second signature, no justification note. The evidence was mathematical, merciless. Mark tried to intervene, voice thin. Maybe it was pre-approved offline. Maybe legal was copied. Clara raised a hand. We checked. There was no backup. Vendor VX99 was flagged 6 weeks prior for incomplete credentials. You pushed it through. Evan's lips parted, desperate. Rachel. She was disgruntled. She had motive. Kaplan's pen stopped clicking. His tone sliced the air. Don't insult the only person in this company who did her job. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Everyone felt it. The pivot, the realization that this wasn't about one vendor. It was about a culture that worshipped speed and sacrificed truth. The quiet ones had finally stopped cleaning up the mess. The moment Kaplan spoke, the room's air seemed to drop 10 degrees. Nobody moved. Even the projector's faint hum sounded accusatory. Evan sat there, throat dry, hands gripping the table edge, as if pressure alone could anchor him to a collapsing career. Clara didn't look angry, just certain. That was worse. She slid another paper across the table. It was a draft contract amendment co-signed by Langard's legal counsel. The new clause was underlined in blue. All future executive overrides shall require dual authorization from compliance and finance. No exceptions. She glanced up. This will be implemented immediately. And as for you, Mr. Caro, termination for cause is being recommended pending HR review. Then she turned to Mark Delaney. Your override history is next. Mark went pale, eyes flicking toward Evan like a drowning man searching for something solid. Evan didn't offer it. The truth was already too heavy. The meeting adjourned with no handshakes, no closing remarks, just the sound of chairs scraping against tile. As Evan stood, he caught a final glimpse of paragraph 3 lying flat on the table, highlighted and damning. That single line had done what no whistleblower or lawyer had managed in years. It cracked the illusion of Brightwell's invincibility. The termination itself happened quietly. No security escort, no shouting. Just 2 HR reps flanking him like parentheses as he walked down the 4th floor corridor at 3:17 p.m., eyes fixed on the carpet. He didn't carry a box. There was nothing worth taking. His office was a graveyard of fake achievement plaques and staged family photos still with the stock watermark on them. By 3:42, his system access vanished. Slack updated automatically. Evan Caro is no longer with Brightwell Systems. The next morning, the company issued an all-staff announcement. Effective immediately, Brightwell Systems has initiated a comprehensive compliance restructure. We thank Mr. Caro for his service and wish him well in future endeavors. Underneath that, in slightly larger font, Brightwell remains committed to transparent operations and full client cooperation. Corporate translation: we're bleeding, but we're smiling about it. Mark Delaney called in sick that same day and never returned. Legal began scrubbing override histories dating back to 2021. Procurement triggered an emergency vendor re-verification. Internal audit implemented new spending controls, requiring shadow approvals before any budget moved. Within a week, Brightwell's executive Slack channels were ghost towns. Compliance wasn't just a department now. It was a warning. Rachel learned about all of it secondhand. Late Friday afternoon, as sunlight cut through the blinds of her small office, she got an email from an old coworker in accounting. The subject line read simply, "You might want to see this." Attached was a memo from Brightwell's legal team. All executive overrides suspended indefinitely. Compliance given full co-authorization authority. Vendor management under direct client oversight. She stared at the document, reread it, then exhaled slowly. It wasn't revenge. Not really. It was gravity. The inevitable pull of truth finally catching up with arrogance. For 10 years, She'd been the invisible backbone, auditing errors, cleaning up inconsistencies, reconciling what others called harmless shortcuts. And now those shortcuts had become sinkholes. She brewed a fresh cup of coffee and sat by the window. Across town, Evan was probably packing his things in silence, wondering how it all collapsed so fast. Rachel didn't need to wonder. She'd seen it coming long before he had. When you build an empire on skipped approvals and charisma, it doesn't fall because someone pushed. It falls because no one's holding it up anymore. Her phone buzzed again. New email. Sender: Clara Schultz, Chief Compliance Officer, Langward Consulting. Subject: Opportunity to discuss. Rachel clicked it open. Ms. Myers, we've been impressed by your precision and ethics regarding your former documentation. We're establishing a new advisory role under the Compliance Office. Flexible schedule. Direct report to me. Would you consider it? No flattery, no sugar. Just recognition. Real and quiet. The kind that actually meant something. Rachel read the email twice, then a third time. The words didn't sparkle. They didn't need to. They carried the rare tone of sincerity you almost never hear in corporate life. She leaned back in her chair, coffee cooling beside her, eyes drifting toward the window where the late afternoon sun cut across the edge of her desk. For years, she'd documented problems so others could fix them. This was the first time someone saw the documentation itself as proof of worth. She didn't forward the message, didn't screenshot it, didn't text anyone. She just sat there, breathing in the small, still moment between disbelief and peace. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like equilibrium finally restored. She typed her reply carefully. Thank you for the note. I'd be happy to discuss next steps. Warm regards, Rachel Myers. One line. Clean. Controlled. Just like the one that had changed everything. Across town, Brightwell Systems was trying to glue itself back together. The CEO issued an internal memo about rebuilding trust through transparency. The PR team drafted a press release so polished it squeaked, but no statement could undo what had happened. Clients had paused new contracts. Investors were circling nervously, waiting for the next headline. Inside the building, the tone had shifted permanently. You could feel it in the hallways, voices quieter, laughter hesitant, optimism rationed. Meanwhile, at Langward Consulting's downtown office, a different tone prevailed. Relief. The compliance crisis at Brightwell had forced them to revisit their vendor oversight models, and Clara Schultz made sure Rachel's documentation became required reading in her department. She printed the paragraph that started it all. Unapproved expenditure. Vendor VX99. Executive override by exception. Unverified. And pinned it to a corkboard under the header Clarity Saves. Nobody joked about it. Everyone knew what it meant. 2 weeks later, Rachel walked into Langward's headquarters for the first time. The building smelled of polished oak and efficiency. She wore a gray blazer, carried nothing but a notebook, and a calm sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Clara met her in the lobby. Ms. Myers, she said with a firm handshake. I'm glad you accepted. Thank you for asking, Rachel replied. They took the elevator to the 22nd floor. Glass walls, wide city view, the kind of skyline that seemed to breathe money. The conference table stretched half the length of the room. We've been revising the new compliance contract for Brightwell, Clara said. I'd like you to co-author the section on vendor authorization protocols. You know where the weaknesses are better than anyone. Rachel smiled faintly. I suppose I do. As she sat down beside Clara, she noticed Daniel Kaplan at the far end of the table. The man barely nodded, but that nod carried more weight than applause. Around them sat half a dozen executives, legal counsel, auditors, and policy officers, all here to rebuild what Brightwell had broken. Clara slid a fresh document across the table. "We call this the Vendor Integrity Agreement," she said. "It's meant to replace every loophole Evan, ever exploited." She glanced toward Rachel. "We modeled one clause after your exit report." Rachel scanned the page. Paragraph 3 mirrored almost word for word her original line from months ago. "All executive overrides must be validated by compliance. No expenditure may bypass dual-party approval. Violations trigger immediate audit." She underlined the section with her pen, then leaned back. "It's strong," she said quietly. "It'll hold." The meeting stretched for an hour, but time moved gently. When the last signature was inked, Rachel stayed behind as the others filed out. The city glowed outside the windows, streaks of gold cutting through the glass. Clara paused at the door. "We didn't name it after you," she said, "but everyone here calls it the Rachel Clause." Rachel gave a small laugh. "Let's keep it unofficial. It'll age better that way." When she finally left the building, the evening light felt softer, cleaner. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it just waited patiently, quiet, meticulous, inevitable. A month later, Rachel sat once again in a boardroom that overlooked the skyline, not Brightwell's claustrophobic glass fishbowl, but Langard's open sunlit conference space, where the air smelled faintly of cedar and control. The new compliance agreement with Brightwell was ready for final signature. Around the table sat executives from both sides: Brightwell's interim CEO, 2 shell-shocked directors, and the legal and audit leads from Langard. Across from them, Rachel and Clara Schultz occupied the seats that used to belong to people who thought rules were optional. The meeting wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every signature that hit the paper carried the sound of consequence. The new contract was short, sharp, and written with surgical precision. Gone were the endless appendices full of wiggle room and jargon. In their place, 3 pages of unbreakable logic, mandatory dual authorization, immutable audit trails, immediate suspension of any vendor without verification. The third paragraph, the one that mirrored Rachel's original line, was now titled Section 3, Compliance Override Governance. As each executive signed it, Rachel's eyes lingered on the ink drying across the paper. It wasn't pride that filled her chest, just a quiet recognition. A single sentence can reset an entire culture if it's true enough. One of the younger Brightwell directors, couldn't have been more than 30, leaned over to his neighbor and whispered, "Was it really one paragraph that did all this?" Clara caught the comment but didn't correct him. Rachel simply closed her pen cap, her voice even and low. "It only takes one line, if it's accurate." The room went still. Kaplan, seated at the far end, gave her the smallest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement from one keeper of order to another. After the meeting, as executives filed out with polite handshakes and tight smiles, Clara placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder. "You know," she said, "most people would have gone to the press, made it messy." Rachel met her gaze. "Messy doesn't fix systems. Documentation does." Clara smiled. "You just redefined quiet accountability." When the last folder was packed away and the boardroom emptied, Rachel remained seated, the city stretching beneath her like a grid of unfinished reports. She opened her notebook and wrote one word at the top of a fresh page: clarity. Underlined it twice, no flourish, no signature, just like before. The word that had followed her through every audit, every late night, every time she'd been dismissed as too cautious or too rigid. Now, it wasn't a warning, it was a legacy. Outside, the wind pressed faint ripples against the tall glass panes. Down on the street, traffic shimmered in the sun. For a brief moment, she let herself think of Evan. Not with anger, but with a detached curiosity. What must it feel like to see your empire fold from one documented truth? He probably told himself it wasn't fair. But fairness was never the point. Accuracy was. Rachel gathered her things slowly, adjusted the chair exactly as she'd found it, and walked down the corridor, heels soft against the carpet. Employees passed her with nods of quiet respect. To them, she wasn't a whistleblower or a hero. She was proof that integrity could outlast politics. That the small, precise act of doing your job completely still mattered. When she stepped outside, the sun was setting, painting the skyline in amber. She paused at the curb, feeling the warmth on her face. For the first time in years, she wasn't holding anything up. Not a department, not a crumbling system, not anyone else's ego. She'd simply let gravity do its work. The building hadn't burned. It had collapsed on its own. As she walked toward the cafe on the corner, her phone buzzed. A notification from Langard's internal chat. "Welcome aboard officially, Rachel Myers, Compliance Advisor." She smiled faintly, turned the screen off, and slipped the phone into her pocket. Justice didn't need applause. It just needed documentation. And somewhere in 1,000 backup drives, buried deep inside audit archives and contract records, one sentence glowed quietly, indelible and undefeated. Unapproved expenditure. Vendor VX99. Executive override by exception. Unverified.